Welcome back to the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Goldseth.
It is Tuesday, March 26th, and we shared about the Lutheran Elementary School Association auction and a dinner auction that's coming up right around the corner, and that's in April. And coming up also in April, this is really a unique experience, the Gospel of Mark Tour. Now, what is it? We'll find out more in a little bit. We've talked about it before, but in case you haven't experienced it...
or are a newbie to St. Louis and need something really awesome to do.
But it's not just in St. Louis.
Oh, that is true.
Tour. It's a tour.
That's what tour means, isn't it?
It is. And they're covering some ground this year. So it's kind of exciting. Joining us today, the Reverend Dr. Kent Burreson. He's professor of Systematic Theology and Dean of Chapel at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. Also one of the presenters of the Gospel of Mark. Dr. Burreson, thanks so much for being our guest this morning.
My pleasure, as always.
Now, the Gospel of Mark Tour. What is the Gospel of Mark Tour?
Yeah, so the Gospel of Mark Tour is basically something that we began about 6 years ago. Dr. James Belts, who is a graduate professor of exegetical theology here at Concordia Seminary, obviously a New Testament expert and an expert on the Gospel of Mark. He was actually working on his commentary for Concordia Publishing House in the Concordia Commentary series, and it took a real keen interest in the performative nature of the Gospels. In other words, that the Gospels in the early church would have been delivered orally. So when people read, quote-unquote, the Gospels, they would have delivered them out loud to congregations, throughout the Mediterranean world. And so that was probably the first way in which the Gospels were disseminated, is orally. So people would memorize the entire text and then deliver that text to the congregations. And so we felt it would be appropriate to sort of return to that practice. What might it look like? How might it feel to experience the Gospels being told or read out loud from with the text memorized. And so that's what we did. We recruited 6 of us to participate in this delivery of the Gospels in this way, and have been doing it now for 6 years. This is our 6th year of doing it.
Wow. I need to go see this. This sounds really fascinating. This year's the year. How is hearing the Word different from reading the Word?
Yeah, so and one of the things we tell people at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark is don't open your Bibles, because the tendency is people want to grab their Bibles and follow along. Mm-hmm. What's different is that you're hearing. There's a different experience in terms of looking at text on a page. So it brings out the reality of the movement, especially true of Mark, but it would be true of Luke and or Matthew or John or even Paul's epistles as well. You get a sense of the movement of the narrative in a different way than reading it, and you see how the whole gospel holds together, the connectedness and the design of the gospel from Mark's perspective. What Mark was trying to do to tell the story of our Lord Jesus Christ. So how did Mark do that? And you get a much greater understanding of how the text ties together. And so there are things that pop out at you in the hearing of it that you wouldn't necessarily notice when you're looking at it on the page. The interconnectedness of various stories within the Gospel of Mark. Even in my section, I do a section. So the way we do it is each of our performers or readers, whatever you want to call them, take a section. So we divided the Gospel up into 6 sections, and I have Mark 8:52 to the end of chapter 10. And so this contains Jesus' 3 predictions of his passion, of his suffering and death. And you see the connectedness in that section of his predictions of his suffering and death, and the inability of the disciples or anybody else to understand what was going on, and how his power as Son of God is manifested in what takes place in that section of the Gospel of Mark, but also that all those things, healing the sick, delivering people from demons, how that all comes to focus in his crucifixion and resurrection. So you see the interconnectedness, you hear the interconnectedness in the whole Gospel in ways that you just don't experience when you're looking at print text on a page.
Speaking of printed text on a page, this isn't just a memorization straight out of the ESV or NIV. Tell us about the translation that's being presented in the Gospel of Mark.
That's a good question, Andy. So when we started the process, I mentioned that Dr. Veltz was working on his commentary for Concordia Commentary Series, and so he was putting together, which is the case for all of the commentaries in that series, a fresh translation of the Gospel. And so we started with his text, his translation for the Concordia Commentary Series. All of us worked on our sections independently to some degree. And so we took his translation as sort of the base benchmark translation, which is a very literal translation trying to capture the nuances of the Greek. And then we adapted it because sometimes his translation wasn't the most felicitous in terms of oral delivery. And so each of us took, usually drawing upon the ESV, maybe the NIV, some may have used some other translations, but primarily ESV and NIV to smooth out Dr. Veltz's translation. So it has the characteristics of his translation sort of at the very base of the text, but then adapted to more natural language flow and speech patterns from the NIV and the ESV.
So this book of the Bible is probably relatively familiar to you and to the other speakers, but what goes into preparing to present in this manner?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we started 6 years ago, and so initially it was for each of us just becoming familiar with the text that we were memorizing, the section of the Gospel of Mark we were memorizing, and in our early performances, I'd probably say about the first 2 years, we weren't necessarily, we didn't have a command of the text that we have now. So it was a matter of continually rehearsing, going over things, and all of us had different patterns. I remember Dr. Michael Ziegler, who is the Lutheran Hour speaker, his pattern was to, and I think it's still his pattern because he's the only one of us, he has the entire gospel memorized. So he can substitute for, if any of us get sick, Michael can substitute for any of us. But I know he went through his house and he would rehearse particular sections of the gospel within particular rooms of his house. So he would associate that particular text with that room in his house. For me, I have a different pattern. I have to sort of, focus on particular sections of the text and just go over them again and again and again. And that's what I had to do to learn the text. And I didn't do it I primarily did it here on campus in our auditorium. So each of us had different patterns, but you had to make that text, it just had to become part of you, literally. So it's literally like eating the text. When the scriptures say, eat the text, consume the text, that's literally what we've done. And now at this point, it's all simply part of us. So I can pull up part of one of my a text within my section and use it in class. I can use it in a Bible study, and I don't have to refresh it. It's just there, and it's a wonderful experience. So I encourage students now, take up memorizing a particular text, part of the gospel, or memorizing one of Paul's epistles, or even just a psalm, because if you memorize it, then it literally becomes part of you. It's never. You don't have to look at the Bible. You don't have to look at the physical text. It's inside of you.
Here's a fun challenge for pastors. I visited a church while I was in grad school and on internship. And the pastor memorized the gospel lesson, the gospel reading every Sunday.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Had the gospel reading memorized. Yep. They would do a gospel processional, and the acolyte would be holding the scriptures there, but he didn't
have to look.
He had it all committed to memory. Yep. I mean, there's really the challenge. Cool. We just have about a minute left here, and I want to let our listeners know where they can find the presentations of the Gospel of Mark this year on the tour.
Yeah, so I should have looked up this information before we got on
I've got it here.
But I know we're performing over in Collinsville, Holy Week, the Tuesday of Holy Week, and I don't remember exactly what that date is. I think it's in Collinsville, and then at least in St. Louis area. And then we're going on the road the first week of Easter out to Redeemer in the Bronx, New York, and to a congregation in Massachusetts, and I don't remember exactly which congregation that is, but you might have that information.
Sure. The website, www.csl.edu/thegospelofmark is the place where you can find all these the dates and locations, starting with Zion in Bethalto, Illinois, on Tuesday, April 16th, headed to Redeemer in Bronx, New York, on April 26th, 27th at St. John's in Westfield, Massachusetts, and then later in the fall, it looks like, headed to Sedalia, Missouri, and Pekin, Illinois. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right.
Correct.
Very good. That's csl.edu/thegospelofmark to find out more about these presentations. The Reverend Dr. Kent Burreson, Professor of Systematic Theology, Dean of Chapel at Concordia Seminary, and one of the presenters of the Gospel of Mark. Thanks so much for being our guest on the Coffee Hour today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Sarah.
That does it for the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@kfuo.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.